Well, good morning. My name is Anna Palmer. I'm co-author of the Politico Playbook. I'm joined by my colleague and Playbook co-author, Jake Sherman, to host a virtual Playbook interview with Chef David Chang, founder of the Momofuku Restaurant Group, and Marguerite Mariscal, CEO of Momofuku Restaurant Group, to talk about how the restaurant industry has been hit by the coronavirus pandemic and what Washington needs to do from their perspective.
Today's briefing is among several virtual events that Politico is hosting in the coming weeks with journalists from across the newsroom. We wanted to remind you if you have any questions for David and Marguerite, you could tweet them with the hashtag AskPolitico, and we'll try to get to them throughout the conversation.
All right, well, let's get started. Dave, Marguerite, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
I want to just get started. I kind of my bias out of the way and kind of how this whole thing came about is I'm a big fan of your restaurants. I've eaten at a lot of them in New York and DC and other places. And I was listening to your podcast, Dave, a few weeks back, where you kind of went off about Washington and what it needs to do to help save restaurants. And it made me think about this a little bit differently than I have kind of from the Washington bubble and landscape of legislating, because the argument you were making wasn't just about restaurant owners and payroll, but also just the kind of entire ecosystem of the vendors and even food culture being under attack from this virus. Can you lay out a little bit of your perspective and how you're thinking about this from that 360 worldview?
Right. Again, I'm not an economist. Just ask any of my college professors how poorly I did in these subjects. But the idea that if independent restaurants couldn't pay the bills because they couldn't be open and the repercussions and chain reactions that it would have, it was to me a parallel to 2008 financial crisis, where the auto industry, financial institutions, insurance institutions, if they collapse, economy would fail as we know it. So restaurants, although small and independent, there are so many of them. They comprise almost $1 trillion of revenue and employ 11 million plus people. They're like banks, except that most of them don't make money because they're constantly giving it back to everyone else in society. Whether you're a florist, you collect the trash, recycle, you're in the beverage industry, you name it. Almost every facet of how we live our daily life is somewhat attached to a restaurant. And we're not even talking about the millions and millions of hourly documented and undocumented workers that were going to potentially be out of the job. And this is obviously the worst time in this epidemic to be that scared about where your paycheck or where your healthcare might be coming from. So I also knew that we don't have representation. There are some restaurant groups and associations. I don't particularly am too fond of them. So I knew that a stimulus bill would be passed, and I didn't know if we would have a seat at the table. So I needed to let people know, it's like, hey, we need help ASAP, because if we don't get this done now, bad things are going to happen.
Did you, the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Act, is kind of the centerpiece of this small business rescue, so to speak, that the government has put together. Did you try to get that? Did you successfully get a loan through the PPP?
Marguerite can speak a little bit more to that. And I know we applied and we're still waiting to hear back like everyone else. Most people haven't gotten it, and Marge knows a lot more about it than I do.
So we went through, for certain locations, more local banks. And so in LA, we were able to get something from PPP just because we went through a localized bank. For a lot of our locations, we went through a much larger player, and we're waiting to hear back like everyone else. I think there's a lot of problems to the PPP in terms of it actually being a long-term solution. I think it basically, especially with that June 30th date, assumes the best. And I think, anyone who works in a restaurant knows that you have to plan for the worst and hope for the best. And June 30th to us is just way too optimistic for anyone pre-vaccine wanting to be in the restaurants and our ability to hire back 100% of our staff.
You hit on this, and I want to talk about a lot of what you just said and unpack a lot of that. But I mean, people, everybody's saying it's confusing. Shake Shack and Danny Meyer just returned $10 million that they got today, but he also had said that it came with no user manual, the loan, and applying for it, and it was very confusing. So it sounds like you had a similar experience trying to get the loan as well.
Yeah, it was definitely tough. I think, we're in the same boat, or even if we're lucky enough to get this money, how to use it. I think there's definitely a strategy to it, just given the way that it's written. If it was more like a line of credit that you draw down on, I think it would be a little bit more conducive to restaurant owners. But this idea of kind of gaming out this June 30th and when are you hiring people back and what percentage is forgivable, given that changed like the night before that you were able to apply. I think a lot of these things make it that even if people have gotten the money, how they're going to use it effectively so it is actually a benefit to their business is a little unclear.
And you all, I mean, you guys have a pretty sophisticated operation, right? You have accountants, you've a lot of different restaurants. I imagine that for the mom and pop restaurant, trying to get this loan and figure out, what can we actually pay this all back by their, pay everybody, get everybody back on payroll by June 30th is kind of an insurmountable challenge in some ways.
Absolutely. And that's probably the biggest concern, is not that there wasn't enough money, is the money that should have gone. We should have put a cap at like $250,000 or $500,000 for the first tranche of restaurants, which should have been, small convenience stores and mom and pop shops. The larger restaurants should get help, but after the fact, I think. And speaking to a lot of my friends that have independent restaurants, it was Byzantine at best to figure out how to get this done. And then they successfully apply only to be told that there's no more money. So I can't imagine the frustration across the board, because we just want help and to know that the government is saying, we got your back. And this is an unfortunate turn of events. I do believe, weirdly optimistically, that the government, not because of altruism, I think, will realize like, oh, we have to do this for everyone or things will turn very, very bad.
You noted your skepticism a little bit of the kind of DC lobby groups that are representing the industry. But this morning we had in Playbook, the National Restaurant Association, which is the largest kind of lobbying group representing chain and independent restaurants as well. But they sent a letter up to Capitol Hill this morning asking for a specific restaurant industry relief fund. They didn't get into a lot of the specifics, but would you support that, kind of taking restaurants outside of maybe the more general relief, where you could have kind of things that were maybe more tailored to the industry and specific in terms of kind of hiring people back and things like that?
Absolutely, I would. And I would also put one more caveat as to the kinds of restaurants that can get that help first and foremost. And I think a lot of minority restaurants that don't have the sophisticated accounting and the wherewithal to figure out all of these things need assistance. And it's not just money. We need to have education to explain this is what needs to happen. And it's a lot more complicated than that after the fact, because we're going to need help getting all restaurants up to regulation for all new safety codes. And that's a whole nother, Pandora's box right there.
And one thing that's going to be a big fight, I think, in the coming weeks and months is how insurance companies and insurance policies handle some restaurants being forced to shut down and being forced to stop their business. Insurance companies say it's not a business interruption, or some have pushed back against that. Restaurants, I'm sure you guys would both say that this should be covered, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would imagine a lot of restaurants are saying, actually, yes. I mean, municipalities have said we cannot be open and this is interrupting our business. I mean, where do you guys fall down on that?
I will simply just say this. After Hurricane Sandy in New York City, how insurance companies found a way to not pay restaurants that paid insurance, I'm not going to be surprised whatever they decide to do, because that was one of the most horrific decisions I've ever seen in my life.
Well, and I would add to that even, there are some people in restaurants that are already starting lawsuits with their insurance brokers, but we all know that even if that gets resolved, it will be months and months, if not, a year before anyone sees anything. And so I think to Dave's point, the most immediate concern is kind of near term cash. But I think you hit on a larger point, which is that I think stimulus in itself is only one part of the problem. I mean, you can give as much money as you can give, but unless there are like systematic changes that follow that, it's not going to do any good. So for example, payroll, I think it's interesting, the PPP targeted payroll for good reason, but that's one of the few cost structures that restaurants can control. Everything else, rent, real estate taxes, payroll taxes, are all fixed costs that with a decrease in business, which everyone is confident we're going to see, whether that's just public demand or whether that's mandated, like in other places have done, of 30%, 50% capacity, all of those numbers will no longer make sense. And restaurants, even those who receive stimulus, will ultimately succumb in actually not immediately upon reopening, but 3 months, 4 months down the road, if the actual cost structure of running their restaurant doesn't change.
What's the biggest, if you could wave a wand and say the government needs to do this in its next piece of legislation, or the government needs to do this immediately and this in the long term, what would that be?
So I think at a state level, there's some flexibility, not obviously in terms of writing checks, but whether that's percentage rent, making it attractive to landlords to give breaks to restaurants or other businesses that are retail focused, just because that's going to be the hardest industry to get back into after all of this. I think looking at payroll tax, looking at some things that can be controlled and trying to figure out if there's incentives that can be made there. Because I think unless we change what rent looks like, unless we change all the other costs associated with running a restaurant, no amount of stimulus is going to save restaurants.
I want to take a little bit of a step back from kind of the policy and Washington, what Washington kind of regulators can do, just to like the practical, what you all have been going through. I think there's a lot of people in Washington, myself included, worked in the restaurant industry at a certain time, but certainly aren't restaurant owners. Marguerite, can you walk us through like what's the last couple of months been like for the Momofuku Restaurant Group?
Sure. So I think like everyone else, we were very, I don't know, probably too optimistic about what this was going to look like. We put together a lot of plans for delivery, a lot of plans for, what does our staffing look like at 25, 50% going into this. Come March 13th, we made the decision pre-New York City to just shut everything down. I think we saw it coming. And, I think we were actually a little early, probably in Toronto and LA and Las Vegas. Whereas in New York, obviously we were hitting kind of what the new normal was going to look like. So we had to furlough over 800 employees, which is, Dave and I can easily say it was one of the toughest weeks, just because not only were you dealing with extremely, horrible circumstances, but you were doing it all remotely. So even just being able to tell your staff that they could not come into work the next day, that we were going to close and didn't know how long that was going to last, and doing all those conversations via the phone when we are such a human to human industry was like immensely challenging. But tried to put together as much as we could plans. We were actually, I think, really early in terms of furloughing employees, in terms of figuring out what the new normal looked like, just because we wanted to give our employees, as horrible as it is, time to plan. Like, how can we say, what does this look like if we're closed in April, May, June, July, and map that all out so that we could give our employees some sort of sense of new normal, so we could start being proactive as opposed to just reactive the longer and longer that this went on.
How did you make that decision? Because there's a lot of restaurants that have decided where they're going to become, almost kind of de facto grocery stores, or they're still trying to do delivery or pickup. But that was kind of decided you'd nix that as kind of an option for Momofuku.
Yeah, we had all these contingency plans because we run pretty paranoid at our company, and I think once it was clear, once we went through scenarios of what would happen if a customer got sick, what would happen if an employee got sick, what happened if an employee was asymptomatic, got home and got their grandmother sick. These were things that we weren't willing to live with. And we described it as a trolley car problem, where you have two scenarios, both of which are really bad. You have to choose the lesser of two evils. And that's what Marge and I were on the phone with all the time, trying to figure out, is there any way to win this? And the answer was no, because there was no way we could guarantee safety. And the cruel irony is, by furloughing employees and not opening up and not putting a paycheck into their hands and pockets, we were also jeopardizing safety, their livelihoods. And it's gonna be a long road to like get through that decision. It's not something I feel comfortable about. And also, we just don't want to jeopardize it. Particularly, I think it's important to note this: New York is a very different place than the rest of America right now. And most of our employees, I would say 99% of them, probably get to work taking some form of mass transit. And that kind of density is problematic. Whereas, talking to chefs like Chris Shepard in Houston or Nick Kokonis and Grand Arcades in Chicago, most of their employees can take cars. And that's a big thing. And their restaurants are a little bit larger, so it's easier to have social distancing and protocol in place. And a lot of the restaurants in New York are small. And again, this goes into the logistical problem I think the government's going to have. Within our own organization, we have restaurants that are 600 or 300 square feet to 4,000 plus. How do you create a plan that is effective for all sizes of restaurants? And we couldn't say, hey, this restaurant that's small, you can open up, but this restaurant over here, you can't. It wasn't fair to our employees either. So it was a lose-lose situation across the board. And we thought the best thing we could do is to be the most conservative and to make sure no one gets sick on our watch.
And you've created a relief fund for your employees. I mean, how successful has that been? And also, what do you hear from them? I mean, I have to imagine a lot of these people are like family to you guys, but what do you hear from them as they're at home or doing other things while you guys are closed?
Yeah.
Go ahead, March.
Yeah, we started an employee relief fund. Originally, it was just obviously to get us through, these tough times. We ended up turning it into a nonprofit because we kind of realized, going back to what I was saying about any sort of relief always being delayed, that the next time something like this happens, and I think Dave and I, once again, being pessimistic, will happen again in some form, in some way. So how do we make sure that we have a stockpile, that we're ready, even if insurance, even if government stimulus, all these things are gonna lag? How do we have an immediate first response? So we made it into a nonprofit. We have been able to distribute over $100,000 so far, but we have some bigger things in the works coming up this week. And I think another reason that I think we immediately closed is I think Dave and I realized that this was a marathon. And so, not trying to the day after you open, do takeout, the day after you open, do grocery. How do you make a plan that's going to last you? What are restaurants going to be doing in May? What are restaurants going to be doing in June? There's a lot more planning that I think can go into these things to make them safer, and they're going to be the new normal. Even when restaurants reopen, the chances that you're going to make all of your revenue from people dining in your restaurant is zero. You're going to have to be creative. I would not be surprised if you still see grocery, if you still see delivery, you see Michelin-starred restaurants, doing takeaway. Like, this is the new normal. So we wanted to give ourselves time to map it out, do it right, because all these things are still going to be relevant for the next year, not just while closed.
Yeah, I want to kind of just follow up on what you're saying, which is basically, I think, Dave, you predicted that, coming out of this pandemic, the restaurant industry probably is going to be changed forever, maybe more of a shift towards home cooking. There's already a big shift toward delivery. What are some of the long-term disruptions that you think the restaurant industry is facing? And are there lessons maybe that are to be learned at kind of the global level, what's happening in other countries that maybe the US will see kind of as trends in the future?
Yeah, it's unfortunate we didn't take any cues from Asia in terms of how restaurants were being operated, whether that was new safety protocols or just social distancing within the restaurant. Or PPE, which is a whole nother problem, obviously, for healthcare sector. But I think that one of the things that we're going to see is we need to be prepared for how employees get taken care of first and foremost, right? Whether that's pay time off, hazard pay. I think one of the things that we can look at right away is abolishing tipping, because it's very clear that it doesn't work for a front of the house worker that might be dependent. We have some servers that make $100,000 a year, and each state has their own sort of policy for unemployment, but you can't be paid on your tipped wages, so that's a problem. So these are things where we can see in hindsight, like, this is very clear, we need to change these things. So these are policies that need to be addressed. And I think right now, the biggest focus for me is, how do we handle the safety moving forward within restaurants and dining? And that's, to me, where I'm looking at mostly at Asian restaurateurs and operations as to what kind of masks they're using, what are their sanitation protocols. Everything that we used to do pre-COVID-19 doesn't work anymore. And we saw this in the beginning of the governors across the country saying 50% occupancy for restaurants. That was just an arbitrary number. It's one thing to say that, it's another thing to say, hey, we'll take care of you, we'll make you whole somehow, because that was a death sentence for restaurants. And if they continue to say that, which I guarantee you they will, here, be open for 50% occupancy, your limit, or you'll be punished or closed or whatever. If we don't have some kind of program to sort of facilitate further growth with this in the restaurants, I don't know exactly whether it's rent abatement, all these things that we talked about, we're going to have a real problem. Again, all of this is going to shift towards delivery, something that we were going to do anyway over a 10 to 15 year period. And combined with home cooking, which I believe was a trend to begin with, going back to that, which is why I think the government needs to regulate the delivery food business. Because it's—
Talk a little bit about that. This is kind of like the DoorDash, the people that are delivering, kind of charging a surplus or a fee for both kind of the people that are getting the food, but also to the restaurants, right?
Yeah, it's unfortunate because we still have to explore that. It's going to be an option that's not going to go away. We feel very confident about that, which is why we're trying to figure out, like, again, like, what's the lesser of two evils here? Most delivery companies historically have charged 30% top line. So if you have a $10 sale, they're taking $3 immediately before the restaurant's allowed to pay off any of its bills. So that's problematic. That's indentured servitude. And that's across the board of like a flat fee. That needs to change. Because I also see the next trend is a lot of these companies are going to be collecting this data from all these restaurants and say, you know what, we can just do it ourselves. So Joe's Pizza, we're selling Joe's Pizza. Now it's going to be called, John's Pizza, and we're making it ourselves. And that they're just going to cut out restaurants over time. And I'm all for delivery and takeaway from these third parties if they can make restaurant lives better. And right now, I think that's not true.
I wonder, you guys operate in Canada, you operate in Australia. I wonder how the government response in other countries that you operate in has been compared to the United States.
Yeah, it's definitely a range. So I think, we've been lucky in Canada, what they've been able to provide in terms of unemployment insurance being substantially, I think, better than what we have here. I think also the bigger takeaway is I think all other countries besides the US kind of understood the longevity of this and treated the solves as long-term solutions. So we're going to top up your unemployment. In Australia, they're working with employers to basically put together stipends for staff, but things that don't have end dates, right? Things that will go as long as there's a problem. Whereas in the US, this check, which, depending on the length, could be a good thing, could be a horrible thing. There's less so solutions that are going to work come June, come May, which we all believe, is going to be the case.
I want to ask in terms of that. I think I've heard, Dave, at least you say that you have been talking to members of Congress, or what's the interaction like? Do you feel like they're receptive, or they're trying to kind of figure this out and, to do the best they can for the restaurant industry? Or do you feel like they're just kind of full steam ahead doing what they need to do?
I won't say who, but I've been surprised at the lack of understanding from most, particularly early on, from New York City level. Happened to speak to some representatives of the city. They were like totally shocked at my sort of dire outlook, unless they got aid to restaurants. I think I've spoken to a couple senators, and I think they were also shocked to the devastation if there wasn't aid. And there's only one person that I've spoken to that gets it and gives me hope of like, oh, not all elected leaders are dummies. They certainly understood it from every facet of the foodways, from growth and harvesting and undocumented workers to unemployment right now. So I was given some hope, and we'll see. We're working with them right now.
All right, well, we will take a couple of questions from our audience. I think the first question is about the president's food and beverage representatives who are a part of the Great American Economic Revival Industry Groups Committee. The question is this, which I think you kind of pointed to a little bit earlier, but is, all of those nominations, they're all male, and they are nearly all non-persons of color. What do you think the restaurant industry can do to ensure it remains an industry of genuine representation, and that those viewpoints are being heard?
Here's the rub. I don't know what we can do, because it's wide. It's important. You have a diverse sort of opinion of what you eat, and it's clear what the administration feels is important to them in terms of the representation they collected for the restaurant industry. All white males, all giant corporations, and 4 chefs, some of whom I've worked for that are great and have 3 Michelin-star restaurants. But this is the problem when you think about restaurants. People forget just how diverse an array of people that make up the restaurant universes. It is from small mom and pop shops to food trucks to taco shops to everything in between. And that was the worst representation of what the food industry is. And that needs to be addressed.
You know, it's interesting that the sense that one of the takeaways from this conversation is something that Anna and I have been talking about a lot, is that government right now more than ever, and this is a criticism of government overall, but government is very slow at almost always to adapt to understand the depth of problems, or the kind of the fast moving sense of or nature of problems. And I just think now more than ever, as Congress talks about, 300 billion or 400 billion, that I think before our eyes, we're seeing a nation reshaped, right? And restaurants are such a crucial part of our lives as people in cities or people not in rural areas. I mean, restaurants just make up such a core of the employment base and the fabric of communities. And we're seeing this industry kind of take shape, reshape before our eyes. And the government, part of the problem is the government is not in Washington, right? But it just seems like nobody has a real grip of how much we're being reshaped right now. It seems like you agree with that sentiment too.
Jake, I would say it's not even having a grip of it. I don't think it's a care. All you have to do is look at the markets right now. How could it be a record week for the Dow and the S&P, all of these things, when unemployment, most of which are service workers, is at the record high? It just shows you what we care about in this country, about the value system of work in this country. And it's not just restaurant employees, it's the entire service sector. You have pharmacists, you have people that are bagging groceries, all putting themselves at risk. What are we doing to protect their interest? And the fact is, we're not doing enough. And the one thing that's going to come out of this, I really genuinely believe, is the service industry, particularly the restaurant employee, is going to be seen as like a whole new light, as someone that is very essential to this economy and to the health and vibrancy of how we live. And that might take place, but it's going to be a painful process to get there.
If policymakers and their staff are watching this today, have one takeaway from our conversation, what do you hope it would be?
I'm going to say two things. Number one, have a national safety protocol for food handling. That has to happen. You can't have each state doing their own thing, which is what it currently is. This has got to be addressed. We need to know what masks, what sanitation protocol, all of these things are just lagging behind. We have restaurants that are currently open doing takeaway and delivery. And the fact that we're waiting for answers, and I know that they have plans and they're just waiting, it's unacceptable. Secondly, I think we need to get money into the hands of real small businesses that don't have the contacts that we have, that are literally like sweat businesses, where like they're rubbing two pennies together, which is the restaurant business to begin with. We need to address the people that have never really been addressed, even in good times. And that needs to happen immediately.
Yeah, I think, as Dave said, I think what's been so fascinating about all of this is seeing grocery, seeing restaurants deemed essential businesses, but I don't think the treatment of the workers has been in line with that designation. So, for example, the fact that in New York City, just this past week, it is now required for people to be wearing masks if you're a cashier, and that your employer has to provide them. That is like 1 month has gone by of no policy, no direction as to how to protect these workers that are essentially feeding America. So we have to really treat these people as essential workers and provide universal standards as to how to protect them.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are quickly running out of time, but we want to thank both Dave and Marguerite for joining us this morning, and thank all of you for joining us for this virtual briefing. It's been great spending time with you and kicking off our week this way.
If you enjoyed this and you don't receive Playbook, which should be very few of you, please text PB to 66866. Stay safe and have a great week.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, guys.